You ever hear your own gate snap open and know it wasn't the wind? The sound hit first, sharp and metallic, echoing across 60 acres of quiet Texas morning like something breaking that shouldn't be broken, and I didn't even need to look up from my coffee to know exactly what it was because I'd been hearing that same sound every weekday for the past 3 weeks, right around the same time, right when the sun started burning the dew off the pasture and the air still carried that damp, earthy smell of last night's humidity settling into the soil, and sure enough, a second later came the low growl of an engine I'd memorized by now, smooth, expensive, confident, the kind of engine that didn't hesitate, didn't slow down, didn't ask permission, just rolled forward like the world was already cleared out of its way, and when I stepped out onto the porch, boots hitting the wood with that familiar hollow thud, I saw it again. That white SUV cutting straight through my ranch gate like it wasn't there, like the heavy cedar beams I'd installed with my own hands were nothing more than a suggestion, swinging loose on bent hinges as gravel crunched under oversized tires and dust lifted in a slow, lazy cloud behind her, drifting through the fence line and settling over the grass like it belonged there, and there she was behind the wheel, sunglasses on, one hand resting casually at the top like she was out for a Sunday drive instead of crossing private property she had no business touching, not even glancing toward the house, not even pretending to acknowledge that she was driving straight through land that had been in my family longer than that subdivision behind her had even existed, and the smell of hot engine and churned up dirt reached me a second later, mixing with the faint sweetness of cut hay from the north field, and I just stood there for a moment, feeling that tight, familiar pressure settle in my chest, not explosive, not loud, just steady, like a slow-building storm you know is coming long before the sky actually changes. Because this wasn't the first time, and it sure as hell wasn't an accident, the first time I'd given her the benefit of the doubt, figured. Maybe she was lost, maybe GPS had sent her down the wrong turn, happens out here more than people think, but then it happened again the next day, and the day after that, always the same path, same speed, same complete disregard for the gate, the lock, the signs I'd put up in clean black lettering that read private property in a font you couldn't possibly misunderstand unless you chose to. And that's when I started noticing the pattern, the timing, the way she cut through at exactly the same minute every morning like it was part of her routine, like my land had quietly become her shortcut to somewhere more important, and I remember the first time I walked down to inspect the damage after she'd passed through, the way the hinge bolt had sheared just enough to throw the alignment off, the gate sagging an inch lower than it should, the latch scraping instead of clicking, and I could still feel the vibration of it in my hands when I touched the wood, that dull echo of force applied where it didn't belong, and I fixed it, of course I did, replaced the hardware, reinforced the post, made it stronger than before, because that's what you do out here, you take care of your own, you maintain what's yours, you don't let things fall apart just because someone else doesn't respect them. But the next morning, same sound, same engine, same cloud of dust rolling across my pasture like it owned the place. And that's when something shifted, not anger exactly, more like clarity, like a line had been crossed so cleanly and so consistently that it stopped being a misunderstanding and started being something deliberate, something chosen, and I watched her disappear past the tree line, the sunlight catching the rear window just enough to flash back at me before she was gone, leaving my gate swinging open behind her again, creaking slowly as it settled into a position it was never meant to hold, and I remember thinking, standing there with the smell of dirt and engine still hanging in the air, that if she believed this was just a road she could take whenever she felt like it, then she hadn't really understood what that gate was for in the first place, and that was a problem I was going to have to fix. I have always believed you can tell who a person is by how they treat land that does not belong to them, and that belief was not something I picked up from a book or a courtroom, it came from standing barefoot in red Texas dirt when I was 8 years old, watching my grandfather run his hand along a fence line like it was something alive, something worth respecting. The kind of man who never raised his voice but never had to because everything he built carried weight, and this place, these 60 acres stretching out past the oak trees and down into the low pasture where the soil turns darker after rain, this was his, then my father's, and now mine, passed down not just as property but as responsibility, something you maintain, something you protect, something you do not let other people redefine just because they show up with a clipboard and a confident smile. And every board in that gate out front had a story tied to it whether anyone else could see it or not. I cut the cedar myself 2 summers ago, measured each beam twice, set the posts deep enough to hold against shifting ground and heavy wind because out here things do not stay still unless you build them that way, and when you close a gate on a ranch, it means something. It is not decoration, it is not a suggestion, it is a line drawn in wood and steel that says this side is yours and that side is not, and most people understand that without needing it explained. Most people slow down when they see it, maybe step out of their truck, maybe look around, maybe respect the silence that comes with open land, but not her, not the woman in that white SUV who treated the whole thing like a mild inconvenience, like my gate was just an obstacle she had the right to push through because it was in her way, and I remember the first time I actually saw her up close, not from the porch, not through drifting dust, but standing right there by the hinge I had just repaired, the metal still cool in my hand, the smell of fresh oil on the bolts mixing with the dry grass underfoot, and she pulled up slow that time, window rolling down. With that smooth electric hum, sunglasses still on even though the sun had not fully cleared the trees yet, and she gave me a smile that did not reach her eyes, the kind of smile people use when they think they are already in the right. You really should leave this open, she said, like she was offering advice, like we were discussing landscaping instead of the fact that she had been driving through my property without permission. And I remember just looking at her for a second, taking in the polished nails on the steering wheel, the faint scent of expensive perfume drifting out of the cabin, the complete lack of hesitation in her posture, and I told her, calm and simple, that this was private land, that the gate stayed closed for a reason, that there was a main road less than half a mile down if she needed access, and she tilted her head just slightly, like I had missed something obvious. This connects to the community road, she said, like that settled it, like a line on a map. Somewhere overrode everything I had just said, and that was the moment I realized we were not having the same conversation at all, because to her, this was convenience, this was access, this was something she believed could be adjusted to fit her routine, and to me, this was boundary, this was ownership, this was the difference between what you ask for and what you take, and I could feel that same steady pressure building again, not anger, not yet, just that awareness that this was not going to resolve itself with a simple explanation, that this was the kind of situation that repeats until something forces it to stop, and when she finally drove off that morning, slower than usual but still straight through the gate like it belonged to her, I stood there with my hand still resting on the wood, feeling the slight shift in the frame as it settled back into place, and I knew right then that fixing the hinge was not going to fix the problem. Her name was Linda Whitmore, and I learned that the same way you learn most things about someone like her, not because she introduced herself properly, but because her name kept showing up where it did not belong, printed in neat black ink at the bottom of letters slipped into mailboxes, stamped across notices taped to doors, whispered across fence lines by neighbors who had learned to keep their voices low when they said it, like the name itself carried weight, and the first time I saw it in writing was 2 days after that conversation by the gate, folded inside an envelope that had no business being on my property in the first place, tucked just inside the screen door like it had always been meant for me, and I remember the texture of the paper, thicker than it needed to be, the kind of stationery that tries to look official without actually being official, and the smell of fresh ink still faintly clinging to it when I unfolded the page and read the words slowly, once, then again, because sometimes you need that second pass just to make sure you are not misunderstanding something that simple, something that bold, something that confident in its own authority. Notice of obstruction, it said at the top, followed by a paragraph explaining that the gate on my land was interfering with community access flow, and that it needed to be adjusted to comply with neighborhood standards, and I actually let out a short breath through my nose when I read that line, not quite a laugh, more like disbelief settling into something sharper, because there is a difference between someone crossing a boundary and someone rewriting it. And Linda Whitmore was clearly the second kind, the kind who does not just step over a line, but redraws it in her favor and expects everyone else to follow along like it had always been that way, and as I stood there in my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator steady behind me and the faint ticking of the wall clock marking out seconds that suddenly felt a little heavier, I could already see how this played out for other people, how a letter like this might land on a different table, in a different house, maybe someone newer to the area, someone without the history, someone without the patience to dig into what was real and what was just written to sound real, and that thought sat wrong with me, not because I needed anyone's approval to keep my gate exactly where it was, but because I recognized the pattern, the same one I had seen in construction meetings years ago when someone tried to push a change through by sounding confident enough that nobody questioned it, and I set the paper down on the counter, smoothing it flat with my palm, feeling the slight resistance of the surface as it settled, and I walked back outside, across the porch and down the packed dirt path toward the gate, the sun higher now, warming the air just enough to bring out that dry grass scent that always comes mid-morning, and when I reached the post, I looked at it differently this time, not just as something that had been damaged and repaired, but as something being challenged, something being redefined without my permission, and I ran my hand along the edge where the wood met the steel bracket, feeling every small imperfection, every place where force had been applied from the wrong direction, and I could almost map out her path in my head. The angle she took, the speed she maintained. The exact moment the latch gave way under pressure, and it was not careless, not random, it was consistent, practiced even, like she had done it enough times that it no longer registered as unusual, and that was when I started noticing the other details I had missed before, the faint tire tracks cutting slightly off the main line where she adjusted for the post, the way the gravel had been pushed outward at a predictable arc, the subtle dip forming where repeated weight had compressed the same stretch of ground over and over again, and it hit me then that this was not just about a person ignoring a gate, this was about someone establishing a habit, turning a boundary into a routine, something that felt small on the surface but carried a different kind of weight the longer it went on, and I could feel that shift again, that quiet transition from reacting to observing, from fixing damage to understanding pattern. And I knew I needed more than just stronger hardware or clearer signs, I needed to see exactly what she was doing, exactly when, exactly how, because people like Linda Whitmore did not stop when you told them no, they stopped when no became unavoidable, and as I stepped back from the gate, brushing a bit of dust from my hands and glancing toward the tree line where her shortcut disappeared into the distance, I realized I was going to have to start treating this less like a nuisance and more like a problem worth studying, because the next time she came through, I wanted to know more than just the sound of it. The next morning I was already awake before the sun fully cleared the eastern fence line, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm in my hand and the quiet hum of the house settling around me like it always did before the day properly started, and there is a different kind of silence out here at that hour, one that lets you hear things coming long before they arrive, the distant rustle of wind across dry grass, the faint creak of wood adjusting to temperature, and when you are paying attention, even the low vibration of an engine still a quarter-mile out, and I set the mug down without thinking when I felt it, that subtle tremor through the countertop that most people would never notice, and I walked out to the porch, slower this time, not reacting, just observing, because I had already decided I was done being surprised by something that clearly followed a schedule, and sure enough, right on time, that same white SUV appeared between the tree line like it had been placed there on cue, sunlight catching the edges of the windshield just enough to flash before settling into a steady reflection, and I did not move toward the gate, I did not step into the path, I just stayed where I was and watched, counting the seconds without looking at a clock, measuring distance by instinct the way you do when you have spent enough years working with land and machinery, and she did exactly what I expected. No hesitation, no slowdown, just a slight adjustment of the wheel to line up with the worn path she had already carved into my property, and then that sound again, the metal latch giving way under pressure, not breaking completely this time but bending just enough to release, the gate swinging inward with a hollow knock against the post as she passed through, gravel crunching in that same familiar rhythm, and there was something almost precise about it, like she had done this enough times to know exactly how much force it took, exactly where the weak point was, and that was when it stopped looking careless altogether and started looking intentional in a way that carried more weight than I had first given it, and I remember narrowing my eyes slightly, not out of anger but focus, tracing the exact line her tires followed, the way the front left dipped slightly as it crossed the threshold where the ground had started to compact, the arc of dust that lifted behind her in a predictable curve before drifting toward the fence, and I could almost see the repetition layered over itself, day after day, the same motion, the same path, turning what should have been a fixed boundary into something that flexed under pressure simply because she kept applying it, and when she disappeared past the rise again, leaving the gate hanging open behind her, I stayed there for another minute, letting the dust settle, listening as the sound of the engine faded into nothing, and then I walked down to the gate, slower than before, not to fix it right away but to study it, to understand it, because if this was going to stop, it was not going to be by accident, and I crouched slightly, running my fingers along the latch where the metal had begun to warp, feeling the difference between yesterday's repair and today's impact. The way repeated force was starting to reshape something that had originally been straight and secure, and I looked down at the ground, at the tire impressions pressed deeper now than they had been before, the gravel displaced just enough to expose the packed dirt beneath, and I followed those marks a few feet inward, noting how they aligned with the slight dip in the terrain, how she had adjusted her path to make it smoother, easier, faster, and that was when it clicked in a way it had not before. This was not just someone ignoring a barrier, this was someone optimizing a route. Refining it, turning it into something efficient, something repeatable, something she intended to keep using, and I straightened up slowly, brushing the dust from my hands again, feeling that shift settle in. Fully now, that quiet decision forming without needing to be spoken out loud, because if she was going to treat my land like a system she could adapt to her needs, then I was going to have to treat her behavior like a system I could map, predict, and eventually control, and I glanced back toward the house, toward the tools I had, the equipment I knew how to use. The kind of solutions that did not rely on asking someone to respect a boundary but instead made crossing it no longer an option, and for the first time since this started, I was not thinking about repairs anymore, I was thinking about design, because whatever came next was going to have to account for everything she had already shown me, and I knew I needed to see it one more time, just to be sure. I tried the simple fix first because that is what you do when you still believe a problem might respond to reason, and that afternoon I drove into town, the tires humming steady against the two-lane road while the sun sat high and bright over the fields, and I picked up a new latch system from the hardware store, something heavier, reinforced steel with a locking mechanism designed to hold against pressure instead of giving under it. The kind of hardware you install when you expect resistance instead of respect, and by the time I got back to the ranch the air had that late-day warmth to it, dry and still, carrying the faint scent of dust and cedar as I unloaded the tools from the back of my truck and walked down to the gate with a clear plan in mind, because sometimes the difference between something failing and something holding is just a matter of using the right material in the right place, and I worked carefully, removing the bent pieces, aligning the new latch so it sat flush against the post, tightening each bolt until the metal felt solid under my hand, no give, no play, just a clean, firm connection that clicked into place with a sound that carried a kind of finality to it, and when I stepped back to look at it, I felt that small, quiet satisfaction that comes from fixing something properly, the kind of satisfaction that says this should hold, this should be enough, and I even added a second sign, larger this time, mounted directly at eye level with bold black lettering that left no room for interpretation, private property no through access, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the gate like it was a statement instead of just a structure, because part of me still believed that clarity mattered, that if the message was clear enough, direct enough, it might register, it might change something, and the next morning I woke up with that same awareness in the back of my mind, that quiet anticipation of a test coming whether I liked it or not, and I took my position on the porch again, coffee in hand, the mug warm against my palm as the early light stretched across the pasture, and right on time, just like every other day, I felt it before I saw it, that low vibration building through the ground, steady and familiar, and when the SUV came into view, there was no hesitation in her approach, no pause at the sign, no adjustment in speed, just that same smooth, confident line cutting straight toward the gate like it had already been decided, and I remember leaning slightly forward without realizing it, watching closely this time, not just the vehicle but her, the way her hands stayed relaxed on the wheel, the way her posture did not shift even as she closed the final distance, and then the moment came, the front of the vehicle meeting the gate, the latch holding for a fraction of a second longer than before, just enough to confirm that the new hardware was doing exactly what it was designed to do, and then the pressure built, the metal resisting until it could not anymore, and with a sharp, hollow snap that echoed out across the field, the latch gave way, not shattering but bending, deforming under force until the gate released again, swinging inward just like it had every other morning, and she drove through without slowing, the same path, the same motion, the same complete disregard for everything I had just installed, and I stood there with that sound still ringing in my ears, the faint smell of disturbed dust rising again as the gravel shifted under her tires, and something inside me settled in a way it had not before, because that moment stripped away the last piece of doubt I had been holding onto, the idea that this could be corrected with clearer signs or stronger parts or a conversation repeated one more time, and I walked down to the gate after she disappeared, slower now, not with urgency but with certainty, and I crouched again, examining the latch, seeing how the metal had warped under repeated pressure, how even reinforced steel had limits when faced with consistent force applied the same way every single time, and I ran my thumb along the bend, feeling the edge where it had given, and I realized something simple and unavoidable. I was still trying to build something that relied on her choosing to stop, and she had already shown me she was not going to make that choice, and as I stood up, brushing the dust from my hands once more, looking out over the path she had carved through my land like it had always been there, I knew that whatever I did next could not depend on her behavior changing at all. That afternoon the heat settled in heavier than usual, the kind that presses down on everything and slows the air until even the insects sound quieter, and I found myself standing in the barn doorway looking out toward the gate, not with frustration anymore but with a kind of focus that felt sharper than anything I had felt since this started, because once you accept that a problem is not going to respond to the usual fixes, your thinking changes, it shifts from repair to strategy, and I walked back inside, the concrete floor cool under my boots, and pulled an old trail camera from the shelf where I kept equipment I did not use often but trusted when I needed it, the casing still dusty from the last time I had set it up along the north fence to track a stray that kept slipping through at night, and I turned it over in my hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, remembering how reliable it had been, how it captured things exactly as they were without interpretation, without assumption, just fact after fact stored in silent frames, and that was exactly what I needed now, not guesses, not impressions, but something I could look at later and break down piece by piece, and I stepped back out into the sunlight, the air thick and still, carrying that faint metallic scent that comes when heat builds over dry ground, and I walked down to the gate again, choosing a spot just off to the side where the camera would catch the full angle of approach, the line she always took, the exact moment her front tires crossed into my land, and I mounted it low enough to stay unnoticed but high enough to see everything clearly, tightening the strap around the post until it held firm, and I adjusted the angle slightly, thinking about perspective the way I used to on job sites, making sure I was not missing anything important, because details matter when you are trying to understand behavior that repeats itself, and when I stepped back this time, I did not feel like I was fixing something anymore, I felt like I was setting a marker, the beginning of a different kind of response. And that night I slept lighter than usual, not restless, just aware, like my mind was already working through what I expected to see, running through possibilities, angles, timing, and when morning came, I did not go straight to the porch, I waited inside, listening first, letting the quiet stretch out until that familiar low vibration started to build again, and I moved toward the window slowly, positioning myself where I could see without being seen, and right on schedule, she appeared again, same vehicle, same speed, same complete confidence in a path that had become routine, and I watched her approach the gate, watched the slight adjustment of the wheel, the alignment with that worn track she had carved into my land over the past few weeks, and then the moment of contact, the latch resisting for that brief second before giving way again, the gate swinging inward as she passed through without hesitation, and I paid attention to everything this time, not just the fact that she crossed but how she did it, the exact angle of her tires, the way the suspension shifted as she moved over the threshold, the speed she maintained, consistent down to what felt like the same mile per hour each day, and there was something almost mechanical about it, like a process that had been refined through repetition, and when she disappeared beyond the rise once more, I did not follow, I did not go down to the gate right away, instead I waited, letting a few minutes pass, letting the dust settle completely, and then I walked out, the ground warm underfoot now, and went straight to the camera, unstrapping it carefully, bringing it back inside to the kitchen table where the light was better, and I powered it on, scrolling through the footage frame by frame, watching the sequence play out not once but several times, slowing it down, paying attention to details that are easy to miss in real time, and there it was, exactly as I suspected, the same line, the same timing, the same force applied at the same point on the latch, over and over again, and as I sat there, the quiet hum of the house around me, the faint ticking of the clock marking each second, I realized that I was no longer dealing with uncertainty at all, this was predictable, measurable. Consistent in a way that made it something I could actually plan around, and that realization did not bring relief, it brought something else entirely, something steadier, something more deliberate, because once you can predict something with that level of accuracy, you can start to design against it, and I leaned back slightly in the chair, eyes still on the screen, watching her vehicle cross that same point again, frame by frame, and I knew that the next step was not about making the gate stronger or the signs clearer, it was about building something that worked with exactly what she was already doing, not against it, and that was going to require a different kind of thinking than anything I had tried so far, because if she was going to keep showing up the same way every single morning, then all I had to do was be ready for it. Once you start seeing a pattern clearly enough, it stops feeling like something that is happening to you and starts feeling like something you can step around, and that shift is subtle but important because it changes where your attention goes, and over the next 2 days I let everything play out exactly the same way without interfering at all. I did not touch the gate, I did not adjust the latch again, I did not add anything new that might change her behavior, because the last thing I wanted was to interrupt something that had already proven itself consistent, and each morning I watched from a different angle, sometimes from the porch, sometimes from the barn, once from behind the fence line where the tall grass gave me just enough cover to stay out of sight, and every single time it was identical. Same arrival window within less than a minute, same approach speed, same angle of entry, same slight correction of the wheel just before contact, and by the third morning I could have closed my eyes and pictured the entire sequence down to the smallest detail, the exact point where the front tire dipped, the fraction of a second where the latch held before bending, the way the gate swung inward and stopped just short of the post, and what stood out more than anything was not just the repetition, it was the confidence behind it, the complete absence of hesitation that only comes when someone believes they are operating within their rights, and that belief mattered more than anything else because it meant she was not testing the boundary anymore, she had already decided it did not apply to her, and that realization changed the way I looked at the problem entirely, because you cannot correct something that someone does not believe is wrong. And as I reviewed the footage again that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the camera feed paused on the exact frame where her tire crossed onto my property, I started noticing smaller details that had been easy to overlook before, the way her vehicle stayed perfectly centered along that worn path, the fact that she never checked her mirrors, never slowed to assess, never even glanced toward the house, and that told me something important, she was not expecting resistance, not from me, not from anything, which meant whatever solution I put in place could not rely on warning her or catching her attention in advance, it had to function independently of her awareness, and I leaned back in the chair, letting that thought settle, the low hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet space around me, and I realized I had been thinking about this the wrong way from the beginning. I had been treating the gate as the main element, the thing that needed to hold, the thing that needed to resist, but the gate was only part of the system, and more importantly, it was the part she had already learned how to defeat, and if I kept focusing on that, I would just be repeating the same cycle with slightly stronger materials and slightly longer delays before failure, and that was not a solution, that was just a slower version of the same problem, and I pushed the chair back slightly, the legs scraping softly against the floor, and stood up, walking over to the window where I could see the line of the fence stretching out toward the road, the land beyond it flat and open, and I started thinking in terms of space instead of structure, of path instead of barrier, because what she had created was not just damage to a gate, she had created a route, a line through my property that now existed because she used it consistently, and if I wanted to stop that, I did not need to make the gate stronger, I needed to remove the route entirely, reshape the space in a way that made her current path impossible to continue without requiring her to change her behavior first, and that was a different kind of problem altogether, one that had less to do with reinforcement and more to do with design. And I stepped outside again, the air cooler now as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground, and I walked along the path she had carved, following it step by step, feeling the slight depressions under my boots, the compacted dirt where the gravel had been pushed aside, and I stopped right at the point where the gate opened inward, looking at the space beyond it not as it was, but as it could be, and for the first time since this started, I could see the outline of something different taking shape. Something that did not bend, did not rely on her choosing to stop, something that simply would not allow that path to exist anymore, and I knew that whatever I built next was not going to look like a gate at all. The next Step was not something I rushed because once you start changing the shape of land, even in a small area, you are not just fixing a problem, you are committing to a decision that stays there long after the situation that caused it is gone, and that meant I needed to be certain, not just about what I was building but why I was building it that way. So that evening I pulled out the original property documents my father had kept stored in a weathered metal box in the back office, the edges of the papers slightly worn from years of handling, the faint smell of old ink and dust rising as I unfolded them across the desk, and I went through them slowly, line by line, not because I doubted what I already knew but because I wanted every detail fresh in my mind, every boundary clearly defined, every measurement confirmed, and there it was exactly as it had always been, the access road ending where my fence line began, no easement, no shared right-of-way, no language that could be interpreted differently if someone decided to read it with enough confidence, and I traced the boundary with my finger, following the exact line that separated what was mine from what was not, and that clarity did something important, it removed any hesitation I might have had about what came next, because this was not a gray area, this was not a misunderstanding that needed negotiation, this was a defined space being used without permission, and once I had that settled, I shifted my focus back outside. Back to the actual ground where the problem existed, because paper defines ownership but land defines reality, and I walked the path again at dusk, the light softer now, stretching long shadows across the compacted track where her vehicle had passed so many times it had begun to look permanent, and I measured it in steps first, then came back with a tape, marking the width she needed, the clearance she relied on, the angle she used to enter and exit without slowing, and I could see it clearly. Now, not just as a path but as a set of conditions she depended on, enough space, predictable ground, a straight line through, and once you understand what something depends on, you know exactly where it can be interrupted, and I remember kneeling down near the threshold where the gate opened, pressing my hand into the soil and feeling how firm it had become from repeated compression, how the loose gravel had shifted outward over time, leaving a smooth, compact strip that made her crossing easier with each pass, and that was the moment it fully clicked. I did not need to stop her at the gate, I needed to change what came immediately after it, reshape that entry point so that the route she had built for herself no longer existed in a usable form, and I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from my palm, looking out over the area with a different perspective now, not seeing it as open space but as something I could reconfigure, something I could design in a way that worked with the land instead of against it, and I started thinking through materials, not just strength but permanence, something that would not bend, would not shift under pressure, something that would hold its form regardless of how many times it was approached the same way, and my mind went back to projects I had worked on years ago, retaining walls, load-bearing structures, the kind of builds where failure was not an option because everything depended on them holding exactly as intended, and I could almost see it in my head, the outline forming where the gate currently stood, extending inward just enough to remove the straight path she relied on, forcing any approach to stop before it even began, and I walked the line again, this time marking points with small stakes, setting rough boundaries for where something more permanent would go, spacing them carefully, checking alignment against the fence and the terrain, making sure that whatever I built would not just block her current path but eliminate any variation of it that followed the same logic, and by the time the last light faded and the air cooled enough to carry that faint evening breeze across the pasture, I had something close to a plan, not fully detailed yet but solid enough to move forward, and as I stood there looking at those markers set into the ground, each one representing a decision already made, I realized that this was the first step. That actually changed the situation instead of reacting to it, because everything before this had been about trying to preserve what was already there, and this was about replacing it with something entirely different, something that did not rely on her understanding anything at all, and as I turned back toward the house, the quiet settling in around me once more, I knew that the next morning was going to be the last time she crossed that line the way she always had. The next morning came quieter than the others, not because anything had changed yet, but because I already knew what I was about to see, and there is a different kind of calm that settles in when you stop reacting and start confirming, and I stood by the window again instead of the porch, the early light cutting across the kitchen floor in long, pale strips, the air still cool enough to carry that faint scent of damp soil from overnight dew. And I waited, not impatiently, just steady, because by now her timing had become as predictable as sunrise, and right on cue, the low hum of that engine built in the distance, faint at first, then growing clearer as it followed the same approach it always did, and when she came into view, there was nothing different about it at all, same speed, same alignment, same quiet confidence behind the wheel, like she was following a route that belonged to her, and I watched closely, not because I needed to see it again but because this was the last time it would happen this way, and she reached the gate, the latch already weakened from repeated stress, and with that same brief resistance followed by release, the gate opened inward once more, swinging just enough to let her pass through without slowing, and she drove across the compacted path she had created over weeks of repetition, dust lifting behind her in that same soft arc before settling back into place, and I did not move. I did not step outside, I just watched until the vehicle disappeared beyond the rise, until the sound faded completely and the silence returned to its usual shape, and then I turned away from the window and walked back out into the morning, the ground cool under my boots, the air still holding onto that early freshness before the heat set in, and I headed straight to the markers I had set the night before, each one still exactly where I had placed it, small, deliberate points defining something that did not exist yet but soon would, and I stood there for a moment, looking at the space not as it had been used but as it was about to be changed, and there was no hesitation left in me at all, because everything leading up to this had been about understanding, and understanding only matters if you act on it, and I turned back toward the truck, grabbing the tools I had already staged in the bed, the weight of them familiar in my hands, the metal cool from sitting overnight, and I got to work, starting with the ground itself, clearing away the loose gravel that had been pushed aside, exposing the compacted soil beneath, leveling the surface where needed, marking the exact line where the first section would go. And there is something steadying about that kind of work. Something that pulls your focus into the present moment completely, because every measurement matters, every alignment affects what comes next, and as the sun climbed higher, warming the air and drying the last traces of dew from the grass, I moved through each step with that same deliberate pace, setting the base deeper than the original gate posts had been, reinforcing the sides where the ground naturally sloped, making sure that what I was building would not just stand, but hold its shape, regardless of what pressed against it, and by midday the outline was no longer theoretical, it was visible, the beginnings of something solid taking form where the open path had once been, and I stepped back briefly, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, the smell of disturbed earth and fresh cut wood mixing in the air, and I could already see how the space was changing, how the straight line she relied on was being replaced by something that did not allow continuation. Something that redirected the entire flow of movement before it even reached the point where the gate had been, and I knew this was only the beginning, that what I had started would take more than a single morning to complete, but the most important part was already done, the decision had been made, the first structure had been set, and there was no going back to the way things had been before, and as I picked up the next piece, aligning it carefully with the marks I had placed earlier, I realized that for the first time since this started, I was no longer waiting to see what she would do next. By the time the sun dropped behind the tree line that evening, the shape of it was no longer just an idea in my head, it was there in front of me, taking form piece by piece with a kind of quiet permanence that you only get when something is built to stay exactly where you put it, and I moved through the work steadily, not rushing, not cutting corners, because this was not the kind of structure you redo later. This was the kind you get right the first time or live with the consequences, and the ground had already been prepared earlier in the day, leveled and compacted where needed, the base set deeper than anything I had installed at that gate before, reinforced along the sides where the soil naturally shifted after rain, and now it was about bringing everything together, setting each section into place with careful alignment, making sure that nothing left a gap wide enough to turn into a new path. Because I knew by now that if even the smallest opening existed, it would be found, tested, and eventually used, and as I worked, the sounds around me settled into a rhythm, the solid thud of material meeting ground, the scrape of tools against wood and steel, the quiet rustle of wind starting to move again as the heat of the day faded, and every few minutes I would step back, not out of fatigue but to check the line, to make sure what I was building matched exactly what I had mapped out the night before. Because this was not just about blocking one route, it was about removing the possibility of any route that followed the same logic, and as the structure grew, extending inward from where the gate once opened, it changed the way the space felt, closing off that straight line she had relied on and replacing it with something that redirected movement before it even began, and I could see it clearly now, how the approach angle no longer aligned, how the ground she depended on was no longer accessible in the same way, and that was the point, not to confront her, not to stop her at the moment of entry, but to make entry itself no longer function the way she expected. And I remember pausing for a moment as the last light faded, resting my hands on the top edge of what I had just set in place, feeling the solid, unmoving weight of it, and there was something final about that, not dramatic, not loud, just certain, because unlike the gate, this was not designed to flex, not designed to give under pressure or adjust over time, it was designed to hold exactly as it was, regardless of how many times it was approached the same way, and I knew it was not finished yet. There were still sections to complete, still details to refine, but the core of it was there, the part that mattered most, the part that changed everything about how that space could be used. And the next morning I was up before the light again, not out of habit this time but anticipation, and I took my place where I could see the approach clearly, the air cooler than the day before, carrying that faint edge that comes just before sunrise, and I waited, not long, because she had never been late, and when the sound of the engine came again, it felt almost routine, like something I had already accounted for before it even arrived. And when the SUV came into view, nothing about her approach had changed, same speed, same alignment, same quiet confidence that had defined every morning up to this point, and she moved toward the entrance without hesitation, the path she expected still visible from the road, still appearing open in the same way it always had, and I watched closely now, not to see if she would try, but to see how the change I had made would meet what she brought to it. Because this was the moment where everything shifted from planning to result, and as she closed the final distance, I could feel that same stillness settle in, the kind that comes right before something reveals whether it will hold or fail, and I kept my eyes fixed on that line where her tires would meet the space I had rebuilt, because up until now, every solution had depended on what she chose to do, and this one did not depend on her at all, and for the first time since this started, I was not waiting to react to what happened next. She did not slow down, not at first, and that was the part that confirmed everything I had already learned about her, because people who believe a path belongs to them do not question it, they follow it the same way every time, and as her SUV came forward, lining up with that familiar approach, the front tires tracking exactly along the worn line she had carved into the ground over the past few weeks, I could see it unfolding the same way it always had, the angle, the speed, the complete absence of hesitation, and for a split second it almost looked like nothing had changed at all, like the space ahead of her was still open, still waiting, still something she could pass through without thinking, but then she reached the point where everything was different, and the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just unmistakable, because instead of that slight give from the latch, instead of the gate swinging inward to accommodate her movement, there was nothing there to move. Nothing to flex, nothing to adjust, just a solid, unbroken line that did not respond to pressure the way the old structure had, and I watched as her vehicle came to a stop in a way it never had before, not abrupt, not chaotic, just halted by the simple fact that the path she expected no longer existed in a usable form, and for a moment everything went still, the engine idling softly, the faint vibration carrying across the ground in a way that felt different now that it was not accompanied by motion, and I stayed where I was, not stepping forward, not announcing myself, just observing, because this was the moment where her understanding would have to adjust to something she could not ignore, and I could see her hands shift slightly on the wheel, the first sign that something had not gone according to expectation, and she sat there for a few seconds, longer than she ever had before, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been doing every morning up until now, and then she eased the vehicle slightly to one side, testing the space, looking for an alternative angle, a way around, but the design accounted for that. The extension inward removed not just the straight line but any variation of it that followed the same logic, and there was no adjustment that would recreate the path she had been using, and I could see the realization beginning to settle in, not all at once but gradually. As each small movement failed to produce the same result it had before, and the engine tone changed slightly as she shifted gears, backing up just enough to reassess, the tires moving over ground that no longer guided her forward in the same way, and the dust that lifted this time was different, lighter, uncertain, not the steady arc I had seen every morning but something scattered, inconsistent. And I remember thinking how quiet it all was compared to the buildup that had led to it, how the Absence of that familiar sound of the gate giving way made the entire moment feel more final than anything else, and after a few more seconds, she stopped again, the vehicle angled slightly off from her original approach, and I could see her head turn, scanning the space in a way she had never needed to before, looking for something that was no longer there, and that was the point where everything changed, not because of any confrontation, not because of anything I said or did in that moment, but because the system she had relied on had been removed entirely, replaced with something that did not depend on her choices at all, and eventually, after one last pause, she shifted the vehicle fully into reverse and backed out along the same line she had entered, slower this time, more deliberate, the confidence that had defined every previous morning replaced by something more measured, and when she reached the road again, she stopped briefly before turning away, the SUV disappearing in a direction I had never seen her take before, and the silence that followed felt different, not empty, but settled, like something that had been out of place had finally been put back where it belonged, and I stayed there for a moment longer, letting that stillness hold, before finally stepping forward toward the structure, placing my hand against the surface I had built, feeling the solid, unmoving resistance of it under my palm, and I knew without needing to test it again that this was not going to repeat itself the way it had before, because the pattern had already been broken in the only way that mattered. And as I looked out toward the road where she had disappeared, I realized this was only the first part of what was about to unfold. She came back that afternoon, and that was something I had not seen before, not in all the mornings she had crossed through like it was routine, because until now her pattern had been clean and predictable, one pass a day, same time, same direction, no hesitation, no follow-up, just a shortcut used and forgotten, but this time the sound of that engine returned long before the sun had started to dip, cutting through the quiet in a way that felt different, sharper, like something unresolved was bringing it back, and I was already outside when I heard it, standing near the structure with a tape measure in hand, checking one of the final alignments along the edge where the extension met the original fence line, and I did not stop what I was doing right away, I just listened, letting the sound get closer until it was unmistakable, and when I looked up, there she was again, the same white SUV pulling up to the entrance. Slower this time, not committing to the approach the way she had that morning, and I set the tape down on the post, brushing my hands off against my jeans as I turned fully toward her, because this was the part one knew was coming, the moment where silence and structure alone were not going to carry the entire weight of the situation anymore, and she rolled down her window before the vehicle had even come to a full stop, the smooth electric hum cutting off as she leaned slightly toward the opening. Sunglasses still on even though the light had softened, and there was something different in her expression now, not uncertainty exactly, but something closer to resistance meeting reality for the first time. You cannot just block this off, she said, her voice steady but edged with that same assumption I had heard before, like the statement itself carried authority, and I stood there for a second, not responding immediately, letting the quiet settle between us, the faint sound of wind moving through the grass filling the space where the gate used to swing open, and then I spoke, keeping my tone even, the same way I had that first morning. This is my property, I said, not louder, not sharper, just clear, and she shifted slightly in her seat, one hand tightening on the wheel. This connects to the community road, she replied, repeating the same line like it had not already been addressed, like saying it again might change what it meant, and I shook my head once, slow and deliberate. It ends at my fence, I said, it always has, and for a moment she did not respond, the engine idling quietly between us, the faint vibration carrying through the ground but going nowhere now, and I could see the calculation happening behind that stillness, the attempt to find a version of this that aligned with what she had already decided was true, and when she spoke again, it was sharper, more direct. You are interfering with access, she said, and that was when I reached into my back pocket, pulling out the folded copy of the property map I had reviewed the night before, the paper creased but clear, and I stepped forward just enough to hold it where she could see it, not close enough to invade her space, just enough to remove any question about what I was showing. There is no access here, I said, tapping the line with my finger, no easement, no shared road, nothing that gives anyone the right to come through here, and she looked at it for a moment, not long, just enough to register that what I was saying was not an opinion, and then she leaned back slightly, the expression on her face tightening in a way that did not match the calm tone she had started with, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said so far, because this was no longer about interpretation, it was about something she could not simply talk past, and after a few seconds, she exhaled slowly, a small shift but noticeable, and glanced past me toward the structure again, taking in the full shape of it now that she was not trying to drive through it, and I could see it settle, not acceptance exactly, but recognition that the situation had changed in a way that did not leave room for the same behavior, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "This is going to cause problems," she said, and I nodded once. Not in agreement but acknowledgement. "It already was," I replied. And for a moment neither of us moved, the air still, the space between us defined not by a gate anymore but by something that did not shift or open or bend, and then she reached up, tapped something on the console, and the window slid back up with that same controlled hum, and without another word, she put the vehicle into reverse, backing away from the entrance with a care she had never shown before, and when she reached the road, she paused for just a second, longer than she had that morning, before turning away again, and I stood there watching until the sound of the engine faded completely, the quiet returning to its usual shape around me, and as I turned back toward the structure, the light catching along its edge in a way that made it stand out against the rest of the fence, I had a feeling that this was not the last time her name was going to come up. The next few days passed without the sound I had grown used to, and it was not the silence itself that stood out, it was how complete it was, how nothing replaced it, no engine approaching at the same time each morning, no dust lifting along that familiar line, no subtle vibration through the ground that signaled something was about to cross a boundary that no longer existed in the same way, and I found myself noticing different things instead. The way the wind moved across the pasture without interruption, the way the gravel near the entrance stayed undisturbed, the way the structure I had built cast a longer, sharper shadow in the early light than the old gate ever had, and there was something steady about that, something that did not ask for attention but held it anyway, because it represented a decision that had already been made and carried through without needing to be repeated, and I continued working on the remaining sections over the next couple of days, finishing the outer edges, reinforcing the points where the terrain shifted slightly after rain, making sure that everything aligned not just visually but structurally, because something like this does not work if it is only partially complete, it has to function as a whole, and by the time I was done, there was no trace of the old path left at all, no worn line through the ground, no open angle that suggested movement could continue, just a clean, defined boundary that did exactly what it was supposed to do without needing to be tested again, and I remember stepping back one evening, the air cooler as the sun dropped low, looking at the entire span from fence to structure and realizing that it did not feel like an addition, it felt like it had always been there, like the land had simply corrected itself, and a few days after that, I saw something I had not expected, a small sign posted near the road on the far side of the subdivision entrance, mounted on a metal stake, simple and direct, community access use main road, and I did not need to walk over to read it to know where it had come from, because that kind of adjustment does not happen without someone deciding it needs to, and I could not help but notice that the direction it pointed lined up exactly with the road I had mentioned the first time we spoke, less than half a mile away, the route that had always been there, the one that did not require crossing anything that did not belong to you, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting loosely at my sides, taking in the quiet change that had settled over everything, not just on my side of the fence but beyond it as well, because this had never really been about one vehicle or one person. It had been about what happens when a boundary is ignored long enough to feel optional, and what it takes to make it clear again without turning it into something louder than it needs to be, and I turned back toward the house, the familiar crunch of gravel under my boots sounding different now that it was not competing with anything else, and as I walked, I passed the spot where the old gate used to swing open, the place where the latch had bent again and again under the same pressure, and there was nothing there now but solid ground and a line that did not move, and I reached out briefly, running my hand along the surface of the structure as I passed, feeling that same steady resistance under my palm, unchanged from the day I set it in place, and it struck me then how quiet the whole thing had been in the end, no confrontation that needed to escalate, no argument that had to be repeated, just a series of decisions made carefully and followed through completely, and as I stepped up onto the porch, the evening light settling across the land in that soft, even way it always does just before it fades, I realized that the most important part of all of it was not what I had built, but what it meant. Because out here, a boundary does not have to speak to be Understood, it just has to hold, and once it does, everything else falls into place, and I set my hand on the railing, looking out over the pasture one more time, the air still, the quiet unbroken, and I knew this was not something that would need to be revisited, not tomorrow, not next week, not any morning after that, because the path she had relied on was gone in a way that did not leave room for interpretation. And as the last light slipped behind the horizon, I could not help but think about how long it had taken for that lesson to finally land.